Alright, guys, so I just finished covering a story about some Patriot Front goons marching in downtown Louisville and how they were just not met with any force. They were just, the police didn't do anything, even though they were carrying around, you know, fucking Confederate flags, literal, insurrection flags, right? And how they treat them with with kid gloves. And so here I got uh, a a few videos of protesters clashing with Gestapo thugs outside of a San Francisco immigration court. So here, let's take a look at this first video.
We're going to start with that clash outside the immigration courthouse in San Francisco. It comes as ICE agents continue to show up for routine immigration hearings, then detain people after their appearance. While this isn't the first time they've been met with protesters, today's confrontation was much more aggressive on both sides. NBC Bay Area's Tom Jensen joins us live from San Francisco with the details captured on camera. Tom.
They sure were, and Janelle, this was unlike anything we've seen out here before, and we've been here since the beginning of June. This was a physical confrontation that pushed through the streets of the financial district for several blocks, ended with a gun drawn, and it all started in that doorway right there. Protesters blocked the courthouse doors as ICE agents attempt to remove a man they've detained inside. A man, we're told, who had just appeared for a routine immigration hearing. They forced their way through the protesters and pushed the man they're detaining into a van. But the crowd moves with them, including several protesters who threw themselves on the hood of the moving van. As some agents climbed into vehicles, others walked from one courthouse to another, with protesters following step for step. As agents reach the second building, another confrontation, including an agent throwing a man to the ground, and then a gray sedan pulls up. The crowd dispersed after that federal officer stepped out carrying what appears to be an assault rifle.
To see the ICE guys going wild with the batons and pushing through the crowd, grabbing people's bikes and using them to hit people and stuff.
Even before the larger confrontations began, a San Francisco man who was on his way to work says he was hit by an unmarked ICE SUV in a crosswalk.
Can I have his badge number and name?
He says he now plans to take that agent to court.
I was in the crosswalk. That's my zone. I was a pedestrian in the intersection.
And for following the procedures, they're getting abducted.
We still do not know why that man was detained. We did reach out to ICE, and we did hear back from a spokesman here in San Francisco who said the agency's putting together a statement. That was a couple of hours ago. So far, we haven't gotten that statement. We're live in San Francisco. Tom Jensen, NBC Bay Area News.
Yeah, it just looks like absolute brutality out there. Here, I have some more videos for you guys. Here, let's take a look.
Oh! Oh! Oh, shit!
Oh my God, they're running over the people in the cars. I do. Yeah, and the problem is they're trying to do it downtown on a crowded street. Oh wow. No, someone's gonna get hurt. There are at least 20 people in front of the car. Someone's gonna get run over. Wow, someone's hanging off the car. Oh my God. Oh, God!
Holy shit.
Oh my God. Holy fucking shit. No, man. This is just...
Yeah, just some awful, just horrific images coming out of San Francisco. Just absolute brutality by these Gestapo thugs. Shame on them, really. But massive respect to the protesters for standing their ground. Good on them for just being willing to put their lives and bodies on the line for freedom and for human rights. Massive respect. This is, just devolving further and further into violence and chaos. And I wanted to share with you guys a video. Yeah, I'll leave the video in the description so you guys can check out the original video as well.
When the Civil War drew to a close in 1865, it did so in an America that had been shattered by violence. It was, in short, a pretty awful experience, one you would think no one would ever want to repeat. Yet polling tells us that a modern repeat of the Civil War is exactly what many Americans think will happen. YouGov reports that 43% estimate internal conflict is anywhere from somewhat likely to certain in the coming decade. Almost no experts believe it will involve vast armies clashing by night. Instead, a modern civil war would likely be a far stranger and far more horrifying affair than you could ever imagine. Titles like How Civil Wars Start, which warns the US is already sliding towards bloodshed, and The Next Civil War, whose author has declared the United States is a textbook example of a country headed towards civil war. But said, there are enough signifiers to suggest something is rotten in the US body politic that makes pondering a second American civil war seem relevant in a way that pondering a Canadian or Australian one just isn't. Back in the Trump years, The New Yorker interviewed Keith Mines, a guy who'd worked for the State Department navigating multiple civil conflicts around the globe. Looking at the US, even pre-2020, Mines concluded there was a 65% chance Americans would be fighting one another on the battlefield within 15 years. Although an outlier, his number wasn't the only startling one floating around. Mines gave a list of 5 conditions he felt many countries experienced before fighting started. To quote him, entrenched national polarization with no obvious meeting place for resolution, increasingly divisive press coverage and information flows, weakened institutions, notably Congress and the judiciary, a sellout or abandonment of responsibility by political leadership, and the legitimization of violence as the in-way to either conduct discourse or solve disputes. If that description feels a tiny bit like modern America to you, you just might understand where Mines was coming from. In her 2022 book, How Civil Wars Start, the academic Barbara Walter writes that countries are more vulnerable to civil war when they are somewhere between dictatorship and liberal democracy. The Economist writes that, quoting, since the end of the Cold War, perhaps 75% of civil wars have been fought between ethnic and religious groups rather than political ones. Here, what matters is not how diverse a country is, but whether politics revolves around identity, end quote. And there's evidence that long-term religious sorting is underway. Since the 1980s, those with strongly held Christian beliefs, especially evangelicals, have moved ever more firmly into the Republican camp. That could potentially lead to a fusion of religious and political identity, akin to what happened in Northern Ireland during the Troubles. But with no rival religious group embracing the Democrats, it does seem less likely. The next item on Barbara Walter's list, though, is much more ominous. According to her research, media bubbles can turbocharge the arrival of bloodshed. In most of her examples, these bubbles were made worse by the poison cocktail of ethnic tensions. The Facebook algorithms amplified anti-Rohingya content in Myanmar at the height of the genocide. The Serbian TV channels that claimed Bosniaks were literally feeding Serb babies to lions in Sarajevo Zoo. You don't have to look very hard to find grotesque claims on social media. Just substitute the word Serb and Bosniak into that last example for Republican or Democrat, and you will easily be able to find something equally disturbing. This last flashpoint, when a large group fears it is losing status. These, then, are the flashpoints we should be looking for if we fear a new civil war. All right, so with that out of the way, let's now turn our attention to perhaps the more interesting question. Once it has erupted, what does a second civil war actually look like? Despite the resurgence of civil wars fought on an industrial scale, there are good reasons to think a second American showdown would be different. The main one being that there's no longer the clear geographic divide we saw in 1861. While large chunks of the South and Midwest reliably vote Republican and many coastal states reliably vote Democrat, the internal makeup of individual states is a lot more mixed. Deep red Texas, for example, has big clusters of blue voting districts, while sky blue California harbors large pockets of overlooked Republicans. Right now, the geography is a lot more muddled than it was in the run-up to 1861, all of which is why the smart money is still on some sort of insurgency as the more likely option. As to what that insurgency would look like, well, history offers us a couple of useful models. But the one thing experts stress is that we, in all likelihood, wouldn't see it coming. Before most conflicts break out, countries go through what the CIA's Guide to Analysis of Insurgency calls the pre-insurgency stage, the part where different groups are radicalizing, recruiting, and stockpiling weapons on the scale needed to fight a war. Other times, it might be out in the open, but that doesn't mean we'll recognize the warning signs. Foreign policy describes the dynamics this way. As the left grows more militant, influential, and strident in its demands, the right tries to inflame social tensions rather than diffuse them. In the years of lead, that inflaming of social tensions included a series of deadly bombings by fascist groups, including one at Bologna train station that killed killed over 80 people. Oftentimes, such as the Milan bank bombing of 1969, these attacks were designed to appear like the work of far-left groups, which only added to the general sense of confusion and paranoia. For experts like Ross, this is the sort of civil conflict America should fear. Politico notes, an army is not required to wreak sustained havoc and destabilize the country. In a deeply polarized environment, smaller pockets of armed unrest could easily ignite and spread disorder. But there's also the Northern Irish Troubles. For much of the back half of the 20th century, a low-intensity civil war waged in the United Kingdom. One that was often referred to not as the internal conflict it was, but by the euphemistic name, the Troubles. Taking place in Northern Ireland, the Troubles led to around 3,600 deaths and over 47,000 wounded. In the 3 decades it lasted, there were no set-piece battles, no Northern Irish Gettysburg. Instead, armed groups like the Provisional IRA and the UVF waged underground war via atrocities. Every day brought new tales of assassinations, terrorist bombings, kidnappings, as well as murder by the British security forces. The fighting was everywhere, but also nowhere, an often urban war that didn't destroy cities like Belfast so much as it annihilated their souls. According to some experts, this may be the most likely face of the new US Civil War, a bloody insurgency where opposing militias operate in the shadows, emerging only to bomb a department store or shoot a politician. While formal state versus state conflicts seem unlikely, what could happen is a messy Northern Ireland-style troubles. Rather than the conventional military forces, there would be gangs and paramilitary groups carrying out tit-for-tat killings. End quote. You might even get a reflection of the British state's dubious role in the conflict. The Telegraph notes that local sheriff's departments and the National Guard units in the USA are often fiercely independent from the federal government. Were the violence to escalate, you might find men with badges playing a clandestine role supporting one local group of extremists or another. Yet, even if the violence were to reach levels comparable to the Troubles, it's doubtful that many Americans would wind up having direct experience of it. Northern Ireland is a small place, with a population during this era of barely 1.5 million. Even so, the majority of people, especially those living outside hotspots like Belfast, never experienced any violence firsthand. The book, Troubled Geographies, talks about how deaths were concentrated in certain parts of Northern Ireland, which meant that the traumatic impact of the conflict was disproportionately felt by relatively few communities. This is what a comparable American insurgency would be like. Something that 90% of people wouldn't witness with their own eyes, but via TV and social media. Not that this would lessen the impact, though. Picture for a moment how tense you get after a series of mass shootings, how the wall-to-wall coverage creates an undercurrent of anxiety for days afterwards. Now imagine those shootings, plus bombings and assassinations, are happening week in, week out, for years on end, all broadcast on TikTok and X by insurgents who want you to see and be terrified by their violence. It would be a psychological war. A war designed to leave you exhausted and numb. One that you could never be certain wouldn't hit your hometown, your community, your family when you least expected it. All sounds pretty grim, doesn't it? That there are some who think a future American implosion could be even worse. Rather than a low-intensity conflict or a long-running insurgency, these analysts predict something far more horrifying: the collapse of the United States into pure anarchy. When we talk about a potential American collapse, there is one key thing that we need to bear in mind which makes the United States different from Italy, Ireland, Myanmar, Syria, or almost anywhere else that's experienced recent civil conflict. That one thing is guns. The piles of high-powered guns in private hands that most other nations only have in small quantities, more than one per person. It's also more than in perhaps any society that has recently collapsed into internal conflict. The theory goes something like this. Attacks carried out by insurgents start to escalate, which leads to their opponents stockpiling their own powerful weapons. At some point, an attack on a particularly sensitive target, say a church or an abortion clinic, sparks a violent backlash from the other side. Politico describes what could happen next. A contagion of localized but widespread tit-for-tat violence could produce mass abdications on the part of local law enforcement and overwhelm the capacity of the federal authorities, turning expanding pockets of US territory into essentially Darwinian enclaves. End quote. This is the big worry of people who study these sorts of things, that America could get into a cycle of reprisals. Reprisals aimed not at the perpetrators of previous atrocities, but entire groups, whether they be ethnic or political. This would supercharge things like nothing else. The fear that the group you are a part of might be hurt or brutalized by the other side is a powerful driver of violence. As a wise puppet once noted, fear leads to anger, anger leads to hate, and hate leads to suffering, or as Politico puts things, large-scale civil collapse need not involve the concentrated efforts of a critical mass of people. Purposeful militias aren't required. Only spiraling acts of violence by small numbers of people that may originate spontaneously, but fueled by retaliation, develop their own momentum. End quote. Look to another horrific civil war, one that erupted not in Europe, Africa, or the Middle East, but in the Americas, but did feature self-described liberals and conservatives massacring one another on an eye-watering scale. A civil war known as La Violencia. Taking place in mid-20th century Colombia, La Violencia struck just as the country was deep in a period of extreme partisanship. Liberals believed that conservatives were plotting a coup. Conservatives thought a liberal takeover of government would leave them permanently disenfranchised. it. On April the 9th, 1948, the populist leader of the Liberals was assassinated in Bogota. His supporters rioted for 3 days, destroying the capital and killing over 3,000 in something known as the Bogotazo. In the aftermath, liberal and conservative-controlled media issued calls to arms. Politicians denounced the other side, blaming their rivals for the carnage. Out in the countryside, dormant militia groups activated. Ordinary people committed the worst kind of atrocities. In small towns, the local ruling party would round up everyone affiliated with their opponents and execute them, dumping the bodies in mass graves. There were reports of liberals using the severed heads of conservatives to play soccer, of conservatives cutting out the eyes and tongues of every liberal in their district. For 10 full years, this wild killing spree continued, a civil war with no clear boundaries and no obvious armies. We should be clear that the circumstances that led to La Violencia were extremely specific. Colombia in 1948 was utterly unlike America in 2024, not least because the country had already fought several civil wars within living memory. Still, we bring it up now as an example of just how south things can go in a nation when people stop seeing their neighbors as countrymen and start seeing them as the enemy. As the New York Times notes, in any given year, only 4% of the countries that meet the conditions for war actually descend into one. At the same time, though, we should also keep in mind what John Quincy Adams' grandson, Henry Adams, once said of the original. Not one man in America wanted the Civil War, or expected, or intended it. We can only hope that decades from now, another famous figure won't look back on our own era and say something eerily similar.
Yeah, so that's a great video by Warfronts there on YouTube. I'll make sure to leave the link in the description. And I'm sharing this video not to try to scare anybody or anything like that. It's just there's a lot of things that just feel too familiar in that video, you know. You got well, mainly it's the Republicans who are fearing losing their grip on power, so they're cracking down harder and harder on dissent. But you know, that also leads to Democrats and left-wingers to feel afraid and to be more willing to, you know, take drastic measures to defend themselves. And so it just really feels like this is all just devolving and, you know, more and more into chaos and violence. And I felt like it was important to talk about that because I'm seeing a lot of these warning signs here in the United States. Of course, nobody wants there to be a civil war or anything, but it's looking more and more like there's already one going on outside, you know, especially with everything going on in California and in downtown LA, and with just the brutality of ICE and of the federal government towards dissenters and towards migrants. And if you want to, you know, also add in the Palestinians too, you know, the enabling of the genocide that's going on over there too. It's, you know, there's just a lot of brutality going on, and that's being normalized. You know, this violence is just getting normalized. And so I felt like it was important to talk about that. Yeah. Hey everyone, thank you all for watching. I really appreciate it. If you enjoyed the video, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so we can make this channel grow. This has been Revolution Television, where the revolution is televised. Peace.